Hi there, I'm Jim Zirin. Welcome back for more conversations. This is a watershed year for the presidency of Donald Trump. With the midterm elections staring us straight in the face, many key races are just too close to call. 6 months ago, conventional wisdom had it that Democrats would win the net of 23 seats they need to regain control of the House of Representatives, and Republicans would keep the Senate, where only 35 seats are up for grabs, of which Democrat incumbents hold 26. Recent polls, however, trend a possibly different outcome, with Republicans retaining control, possibly over both chambers. Yet political analysts are chewing on what has been the impact of Trump's kid gloves reaction to the Saudi murder in Turkey of the dissident journalist Jamal Khashoggi. Also, pollsters are factoring in which party gains from the chaotic Kavanaugh confirmation hearings and the possible backlash from female voters. And what impression has Trump left on the electorate with his feckless diplomatic overtures to North Korea and seemingly incoherent approach to Vladimir Putin? Here to help us with the issues is political analyst and Fox News contributor Doug Schoen, the best pollster I know. I'm delighted to welcome Doug back to the program.
Jim, thank you for having me.
Now, 5 months ago you were here, and you were asked what the outcome of the election would be, whether the House would flip and become Democratic. And this is what you said. I have a question for you.
Sure.
I always have a question.
You have many
and
questions.
You always answer it so well.
Thank
and
you.
my question is, will the House flip? In 2018, you've perhaps answered it, but please tell us why.
The House will flip. We have 40 Republican retirements. We have a sea of blue on the West and East Coast where Republicans are in trouble in substantial measure because of a tax bill that was punitive. And we have public opinion, which typically holds the party in power, the Republicans, accountable. They only passed one piece of legislation, the tax bill, which in and of itself is not popular. So I believe, yes, Jim, the House will flip.
Well, you said the House would flip 5 months ago. Have you changed your mind?
I don't think there's anything I really need to say to add to that. The only serious caveat that I'd offer is the polls show a bit of tightening in the last couple of weeks post Kavanaugh, which you alluded to. And I'd say on the Senate level, there's been an improvement in the Republican position, clearly in red states. In the marginal congressional districts, there's about a 25, 26, 27 seat Democratic victory now. I think it will hold up, and I think what I said 5 months ago is absolutely accurate, and I stand by it, Jim.
So let's just look at the two Ks, Kavanaugh and Khashoggi, for a moment.
Sure.
In Kavanaugh, there's a possible backlash from women who feel that Christine Ford was not given a fair shake. And there's also a backlash from men who think that men are unfairly accused. Which one is going to win out in the he said, she said?
Well, so far, and we have a couple of weeks to go. I think we've got 14 days, if memory serves. We are seeing that the red states have moved pretty substantially in the direction of the Republicans in the marginal Senate races. We'll probably go through them later, district by district, state by state. But for now, I think we're seeing more impact of a positive nature for the Republicans from the Kavanaugh hearings than we are so-called backlash for the Democrats.
But what about the female Republicans? Are they going to vote for Republicans after this performance in Washington?
Well, I think from what I've seen in the polls, there are about 65 to 70% of the female Republicans are still Republicans. So I think the answer overwhelmingly is yes.
And what about male Democrats? Are male Democrats going to feel threatened and feel that Kavanaugh was unfairly accused and decide to vote Republican?
I think male Democrats are going to put their party identification ahead of any presumed or potential demonization of Justice Kavanaugh or any other man. And I think you'll see Democratic men voting 85, even 90% for the Democratic candidate in their state or district.
We're living in a strange political age, aren't we, where facts don't seem to matter very much. If you're a Democrat, you see facts one way. If you're a Republican, you see facts another way. It's almost like the Supreme Court. If you're appointed by a Democrat, you interpret the Constitution one way, and a Republican another way.
Oh, and I would say that latter point is very sad. I believe very strongly in the separation of powers. I believe that you make judicial decisions based on precedent, not ideology. And I think that one of the impacts of the so-called fake news or the lack of truth in our system is that it has a corrosive impact on democracy.
Well, let's go to the second K, which is Jamal Khashoggi. The evidence seems quite strong that he was murdered in the Saudi consulate in Ankara, and yet Trump has been very slow to accuse the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia of being responsible, although it appears that he was. Indeed has sent his Treasury Secretary Mnuchin to a conference in Saudi.
Well, first, I'm not sure Mnuchin is going to the conference. I do believe that he is going to have high-level meetings with the Saudis at the same time of the conference. The other question you posed, which again, I think is part of a two-part issue. One, did the Saudis order the murder at the highest levels of Khashoggi? And if that is the case, which could well, in fact, be what happened, was the Crown Prince, MBS, responsible? Those are big issues, but I think what Trump is concerned about is a third or perhaps fourth issue. And Trump's concern, as I see it, Jim, is he does not want our strategic relationship with Saudi Arabia to be challenged, and particularly the arms sales. Now, that gets into a fourth question, not to get too complicated. Will we seek sanctions under the Magnitsky Act against those who are alleged to be the perpetrators? Those are the issues before us. And on the question of today, will it impact the Senate and House elections? I don't think so.
You don't think voters are going to be concerned about a cavalier attitude toward the extrajudicial murder of a journalist?
No, I don't. I mean, if you saw last week, Trump was in, I think, Montana, if I have it right, and he praised a guy, I think his name is Greg Gianforte, a congressman, for body slamming a journalist before the special election for Congress, and he was praising Gianforte, and Gianforte will probably be reelected.
So from body slamming to murder, it's
a slippery slope. And
plays well with his base.
Well, it does. I mean, you know, you remember from the rallies in 2016, I'm sure, that a certain applause line for Donald Trump was attacking the media.
Now, what about immigration? Is that an important issue with voters when we see this caravan of migrants coming in from Central America?
Yeah, I think it is. And if there is any way for my sage prognostication to be wrong, it'll be if the caravan gets to the Mexico-U.S. border, there is a confrontation, potentially Trump calling out the military or the National Guard or an enhanced ICE presence. That could swing a close election. And already we're seeing in some of the polls a closeness between that issue and how people will vote.
Well, it is a great challenge for the Trump administration because legally we can't turn them back because they don't come from a contiguous country. So they have to be brought in, and then there has to be due process, and then they're deported.
Right.
Of course, the past, there haven't been such large numbers, and basically our policy has been catch and release and hope they show up for a deportation hearing. So they wind up living in the shadows somewhere in the United States.
Right, and I think with an election coming up, the president having taken the position he has, you will see a much more assertive presence at the border than we've ever seen before.
Now, the stock market took a big dive today. And
yes.
Big dive yesterday. Is the possibility of a market decline, a dramatic market decline, will that influence the election?
Certainly will not help Donald Trump and the Republicans' argument that we're having great economic news. Now, typically there is a lag between the market going down and its impact on public opinion. People do not typically follow the stock market day to day. They open their 401k statements at the end of a month, and I guess it's possible we could see some downward drift for the Republicans as people get statements right before or on Election Day, but that remains to be seen.
Now, you're not always correct in your predictions, because last time you were here, you predicted that Bob Mueller would issue his report before the midterm election. It now seems very clear that it will not come out until afterwards. Meanwhile, he's issued some indictments, but not alleging any domestic involvement. Does the Mueller report cast a shadow on the Trump presidency in the minds of voters?
At this point, no, because there has been no evidence of collusion between the Russians and the Trump campaign or Trump as an individual. And I think Mueller is taking great pains to make what appears to be two specific arguments. One we know, the other we don't know. The one we know is that he's going to make an argument about obstruction of justice, and he will presumably have 3 or 4 instances that reflect that. The one we don't know is the argument on collusion, which was the basis for his original appointment. So I think it's taking longer than I expected, simply because that second issue is proving more difficult for him to pin down.
Well, Manafort has said he's cooperating. He's someone in a position to know the whole story. Michael Cohen has certainly been an indication that he's cooperating, and he may know a lot, particularly since the Steele dossier alleged that he paid money to Guccifer to hack the Democrats. So Mueller ought to be bringing things to some sort of conclusion.
Well, I think that is going to happen between Election Day and Christmas would be my best guess. And, the issue with Michael Cohen is, did he go to Prague to meet with the Russians? So far, there's no evidence that he did. He maintains adamantly he didn't.
But his lawyer indicated that he did go.
He did go to Prague.
Yeah.
News to me. If that has been established, that would, I think, provide a level of credibility for the Steele dossier, and also make a compelling case about collusion. But again, it remains to be seen whether that will be asserted and proven as a fact. If, as you say, it is, and if Paul Manafort is able to say that he not only communicated with his Russian and Ukrainian clients, but made Trump aware of what those communications were and how he was interfacing with them, then we could have a very different political lay of the land.
Now, suppose the House flips and is a majority Democrat. Will they file a bill of impeachment against the president?
Well, if there is evidence of collusion, as well as 4 or so instances of obstruction, I think we're going to have a robust debate about impeachment. I can't say definitely yes, but I sure think it will be explored.
Now, you have predicted, let's talk about the Senate races.
Sure.
You've predicted that the Senate will remain Republican. Of course, Chuck Schumer says that there's a path to victory, and NBC News says there's a path to victory. Right. Do you see any path to victory?
Jim, at this point, as I look at the marginal districts, I would say almost impossible for the Democrats to win the Senate.
Which are the key races, in your judgment, that could go the other way?
Well, for example, the Nevada and Arizona.
Both too close to call, according to the polls.
That's right. Though if both those went, that would certainly support the Democratic argument. Until recently, it looked like Florida was going to go Republican. Missouri is in play. Montana's in play. North Dakota appears to be in the Republican column, and Tennessee, which appeared to be in play, now appears to be safe Republican.
And New Jersey, may be in play.
Could be. I think it's a Democratic enough state that Menendez will hold on, but I don't rule out the possibility that Hugen could win.
So unless Nevada, Arizona, Tennessee, Florida go Democrat, which you don't see as a likely prospect, all of them, there's no path to victory.
Not that I see.
And what about the key congressional races? Are there key states where it could go either way?
Given that you've cast aspersions on my predictive ability.
Not as to elections, only as to when Mueller will file his report, as to which lots of people have been wrong.
I go back to my sage words from 5 months ago, where I said that the tax bill was unpopular and that it would hurt the Republicans. The evidence suggests in New York, California, New Jersey, Connecticut, that the non-deductibility of state and local taxes, which I was talking about, has contributed to the sense that the cost of living is really getting tougher and tougher on both coasts. And I think that in and of itself could help on both, the western and eastern extremes of the country to flipping the House, assuming the middle of the country is relatively constant.
Now, we talked about Kavanaugh, and we also talked, many of the elements of the press have talked about a blue wave and that there'll be a landslide victory for the Democrats. But and I think you would agree the election is a referendum on Donald Trump and his stewardship. Is it also a referendum on the Kavanaugh appointment?
It is a referendum on the Kavanaugh appointment to some extent, on the Trump presidency, but also on democratic liberalism, which is the attack line of the Republicans, which so far has had at least some degree of credibility.
Is Kavanaugh really the secret weapon that the Republicans have for stopping a blue wave?
I think in the sense that mobilization of Republicans in terms of enthusiasm is in large measure due to Kavanaugh. It woke up a lot of sleepy Republicans. So I don't know if I'd call it a secret weapon, but it surely worked out the way the Republicans hoped to galvanize their vote.
Well, is the key to the election voter turnout? And will we see a lot of Republicans who otherwise would have sat back and done nothing voting because of Kavanaugh?
I think that is what we're seeing in many but not all the polls. And it really, midterm elections tend to be much more about turnout than they do about persuasion. So I can only say that the evidence that I've seen suggests that since the confirmation, Republicans have only gotten more interested. Now, Democrats have also remained interested, and levels in the Wall Street Journal NBC poll this weekend were pretty close with a 4-point Democratic advantage in enthusiasm.
And what about the issue of race? Many have argued that Trump was only able to win because black voters stayed home, having been disillusioned not only with the Clintons, but also with Obama, whom they viewed as an icon, a dream come true, and then he really didn't do much for them. Do you see black voters as energized in this election?
Again, there's some evidence in the polls that they have become energized. Similarly for Hispanics, but clearly, unless we are missing our guess, there still will probably be a gap in minority turnout versus majority white turnout.
Has Trump's approval rating improved since the Kavanaugh confirmation?
Up to 47% in the Wall Street Journal poll. Now, there are other polls that have it much lower, but I think he's marginally improved and is in a position to do more good for the Republicans as Election Day approaches than we might have expected.
And what are the elements of his base? Where has he gained approval? In what areas of the electorate?
He has seen some improvement with younger people, some improvement with women, though the gender gap is as big as anything I have ever seen. Put another way, Jim, the economy, really prior to the last couple of days or couple of weeks, the stock market has been so good for so long. One of the problems the Republicans have is they haven't been able to fully take advantage of all the good news that's been generated.
And what about the scandals? Nothing seems to stick to him. It's Stormy Daniels and Kristen McDougal and his disparaging comments about women, the last of which is calling Stormy Daniels horseface, which her lawyer says is disgustingly misogynistic. I mean, isn't this a huge turnoff to women?
Well, obviously it is, because there's a 30-point gender gap. But is this going to engender more movement to the Democrats? I'm not so sure. Stuff just doesn't stick to Trump, as your question suggests.
And why is that?
I think he's so out there. You get a sense of him as every man, with his flaws and strengths in plain relief. And he is who he is.
He's Oliver Cromwell, warts and all.
Exactly.
Now, what about Trump's foreign policy? I mean, that's nothing to write home about. Do you see that as influencing the election?
I don't see it as influencing the election, but I do see it as incoherent. I think I'm very scared about what's happening in the Korean Peninsula. I have no sense that the North Koreans are doing anything other than flatter Donald Trump. I worry about our NATO alliance fraying. I worry with our pulling out of the intermediate range nuclear weapons agreement, that it will produce another arms race. I think how we've handled Mexico and Canada leaves much to be desired.
So what about China and the trade war? I mean, it may bring down the U.S. economy.
It could bring down our economy and their economy too, and could also undermine our position in Asia. Jim, I don't think any of this will come to fruition enough to impact the House and Senate elections, but by 2020, I'm pretty sure we'll have a greater sense of its precise impact on the world and its impact on the presidential.
Well, let's just look ahead. Now, this is really asking you to be not only a forecaster, but a grand vizier. What do you see is happening in 2020?
Well, I think there are a couple of caveats. First, unless Bob Mueller is able to pin on Donald Trump personally elements of specific collusion with the Russians, then I think he will get through whatever happens in the House and Senate with 15 or 20 Democratic candidates potentially. I think that Donald Trump will have a field day attacking all the Democrats. And as we sit here today...
From Pocahontas to Bernie Sanders.
Right. And as we sit here today, I make the clear prediction that if there is no proof of collusion, when you are hopefully kind enough to have me back, we will be talking 2 weeks out from the election in 2020 about how Donald Trump is the prohibitive favorite for re-election.
Well, what do you see as the big issue for the Democrats? It has to be something other than I'm not Trump. What could it be? I mean, they'll say that, but they have to say something more, don't they?
How about the level of uncertainty in our world, the uncertainty in our economy, the uncertainty in how our system works, the lack of stability, predictability, certainty? I think that's a pretty good start, and I think we'll have evidence domestically and internationally to support that. But what we don't have now is a candidate.
So who do you see as the best Democratic candidate?
You know,
what do the polls say?
Well, I'll tell you what the polls say. Easier for me to say that. I have an emotional affection for, respect for, and desire to help Mike Bloomberg, our mutual friend, should he run. But what the polls say now is that Joe Biden is the overarching front runner.
And you don't see him as too old, or?
Well, if he'll be 78 and Donald Trump will be 73, I think the age gap will be, at the very least, minimized.
And you don't think that he will be viewed as a has-been, more of the same, more of the liberal politics?
I think that could come up, but at this point he's got a 20-point lead. He speaks to working class voters, and I think that he has got a common touch, particularly with middle America that Secretary Clinton lacked.
What about a woman on the Democratic ticket?
I think we'll see that. I think we may see that on the Republican ticket as well.
And who do you see is on the Democratic ticket?
Well, you have Gillibrand as a potential candidate, Kamala Harris, Elizabeth Warren. Those are three possible.
Amy Klobuchar?
Amy Klobuchar, certainly.
And on the Republican side, Nikki Haley?
Another prediction, and you will hold me to it. I know that, Jim. I think that Mike Pence will go off, and they will put Nikki Haley on the ticket.
And Nikki Haley will be on the ticket.
That's what I'm saying.
How can they demote Mike Pence?
I don't know if they'll demote him as put him out to pasture.
So I have a question for you. I always do.
You do.
The question is, come January of next year, will we see a Democratic House and a Republican Senate or something else?
We'll see a Democratic House narrowly, a Republican Senate with one or two additions, and we will have divided government, polarization, hearings on impeachment, and candidly, something worse than what we have, and the best case is more of the same. I'm as depressed as you are and as pleased as I can be to be here.
Not a pretty picture, except that you're here.
Exactly.
Doug Schoen, thank you
Jim,
so
thank
much
you.
for coming by. You're always a breath of fresh air.
I'm happy to do it.
And thank you for coming by. Tune in next week for more conversations. I'm Jim Zirin. Take care and all the best.